Okay, so hello everyone and welcome back, and today we'll be getting into the history of the Texas Special, which was a joint operation between the Frisco and the Katy railroads in Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri and I think Kansas, yeah, part of Kansas, and we'll get into that. So we're not just going to be talking about the Texas Special today. This is going to be a little brief outline of what we are going to talk about. We're going to be talking about the history, a little brief history of the Frisco, history of the Katy. I say early trains, but like I just didn't change the slide, but it's going to be more, you know, other trains that kind of ran in the network, not necessarily predating the Texas Special, but just there in general. Then the Texas Special itself, and then on into like food service and kind of the modern era, which is more or less the normal outline of a lot of these videos. So this is a map of the Frisco network, or formerly known as the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad or Railway. I'm not never always know which one they call it. And honestly, some of these railroads ping pong between the names of railroad and railway a few times through bankruptcy. So I don't know. I just always go with railroad just for the sake of my own sanity. Anywho, this was one of the many attempts to build a transcontinental railroad between its two namesake cities of St. Louis and San Francisco. The Missouri Pacific was also another attempt at building a transcontinental railroad from St. Louis to California. Frisco was the other half of that network when we'll get into this whole thing. This railroad was originally chartered by the state of Missouri in 1849, and due to the activities of the Santa Fe, the Frisco never made it to the West Coast. And the furthest west it made it is Floydada, Texas, which no idea where that is, never been to it, probably never will, but it was the end, the westernmost extremity of the Frisco system. And I'm not entirely sure if because of that it went south, but the system went more south as time went on, at least in its like getting away from its core service areas. But anyways, back to more of the history of the Frisco. It was originally built between St. Louis and Vinita, Colorado, Oklahoma. In 1870, it was under the leadership of John C. Fremont, and there were attempts to build it to Isleta, New Mexico, and Needles, California, which was the, if you know railroad history, is actually the transcon that the Santa Fe has now. But due to financial trouble, part of the system was absorbed into the Missouri Pacific, and the New Mexico to California part was absorbed into the Santa Fe. And during the subsequent reorganization of the railways in Missouri, one route became the route between St. Louis and Kansas City became part of the Missouri Pacific, and the Transcon's now part of the Santa Fe. And more or less, if I remember this correctly from the Missouri Pacific video, is that basically there was like one kind of giant railway, and it was just more or less split into two parts, and one part became the Frisco, the other part became the Missouri Pacific, if I'm remembering that story correctly. These there's a lot of incestuous like relationships with a lot of these businesses back in this day, so it's kind of always hard to like piece together where exactly some of these things crossed and well, got fraudulent or bankrupt or both. But the Frisco was instrumental into the development throughout Oklahoma, Missouri, and Texas. Many of the towns along the railway developed because the railroad needed somewhere to refuel and let their crews rest. The most notable place that developed was Springfield, Missouri. The city sits at the crossroad of the two main trunks of the not the Katy system, the Frisco system, which is the branch that goes up to Kansas City and down to Pensacola and Birmingham, and the trunk that serves St. Louis and Texas and into Oklahoma. Springfield became the headquarters and primary maintenance location for the Frisco, and it existed prior to the railroad. It was a stop on the and an overpoint on the Trail of Tears and other trails that went west as time went on. So it's kind of fitting that the railroad eventually would make this into a crossroads, even though, again, there's also bad history because, Trail of Tears and whatnot. Again, then this isn't a history about the Native American channel, although I sometimes talk about it because the railroads were very intertwined in their history as well. Thank you, land grants, which are not subsidies if you really ask the pedantic people, which I do consider them subsidies, because what else was a cash poor government gonna give people and had a crap load of land to just give you for selling? Anywho, that rant aside, and the Frisco was also built to a different was also different than the Grangers to the north. Almost built to a different gauge there. I need to check my prescription. Oh well, on my glasses. Mostly because they weren't just a produce hauler. The Frisco connected deeper into the south than the Grangers tended to. And one of the main characteristics of the Grangers were that they were middlemen along with hauling the various harvests throughout the Midwest, but the Frisco had connections further afield. And since it ran all the way to the Gulf Coast, it had connections to the petrochemical industry as time would go on. And also, unlike, the Rock Island, for example, they had just had better routes between big cities, which in a sense made them more like the Burlington, with more of an industrial base. I mean, well, the Burlington kind of also did because of the Chicago, but anyways. As time went on, the Frisco fell under the control of the Reed Syndicate that also owned the Rock Island and took control of the Chicago and Eastern Illinois railroads at this point. And this was one of the last attempts to build a full transcontinental railroad. And I mentioned this in one of the Rock Island videos. They eventually did make it as far as Tucumcari, where they would link to the El Paso and Southwestern that eventually came under the Southern Pacific. Which is just another reason why I think the SP and Rock Island merger would have been a much more sensible merger than with the Union Pacific. I also never knew that the Chicago and Eastern Illinois got absorbed into that whole business dealing, although it kind of makes sense, but it also, again, if you have the Rock Island, why do you need the connection to St. Louis or Chicago? I don't really know. Anyways, also just again, people building empires back then, so who knows? Anyway, the Katy is I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, briefly, because, it's the Katy. The Missouri, Kansas, Texas lines, or Katy, as it was known, it has a bit of a different story. It was a Granger that ran north-south between its namesake states, which is actually more like the Illinois Central than it is like most of the other Grangers. Most of the other Grangers ran east-west. This one ran north-south, which is kind of unusual, given that, most of them were east-west routes rather than north-south. It started by connecting Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley, and Fort Gibson, and it started out with land grants from the federal government. Originally, the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, who was also the person who led the Confederacy, just for the, to clear that one up, was the person who originally organized the railroad, and it was, its construction was stalled because of the Civil War, which, if your original president is Jefferson Davis, who led the Confederacy, obviously there was going to be war troubles there. Anyways, after the railroad struggled, since the Chisholm Trail, which it runs near, was sparsely populated and only generated cattle traffic, this is when the railroads fell into the orbit of Jay Goode. I could have put a little symbiote there. Sorry, Stargate reference. Anyways, this holding became the Missouri-Kansas division of the Missouri Pacific Railroad, which solidified his hold on Texas. By this point, he had held the three big railroads in Texas, which were the Missouri Pacific, the Texas and Pacific, and the International Great Northern. As time went on, the Missouri Pacific was forced to divest the Katy, and it became an independent company that competed against and sometimes worked with the Frisco. The notable expansion during the Goode period was an expansion to Kansas City, and the Katy never really expanded more into Oklahoma beyond this. It still was more or less a north-south railroad. Anyways, we're going to be looking briefly at the route of the Texas Special before we get fully into it. So, in the reading about the Texas Special, it was a train that started running in 1915 and was discontinued during World War II and then revived after the war with streamlined equipment. So, from what I can tell, there really wasn't a secondary train or a predecessor to it, really, along, besides the Blue Bonnet at least, which ran up to Kansas City, which I didn't put on the map because I couldn't figure out which leg it went up. So, just we'll just leave it. Just move on with life. Sometimes it's just easier to do that. But anyways, for its first 2 or so years of its existence, it actually ran the Katy routes into St. Louis, which ran from Kansas City up here. Hopefully you can see the arrow, and then ran across Missouri. Not sure which of these 3 lines it was. It just was one of them. Actually, the Jefferson City one, that's, I think, the Missouri Pacific, if I remember right. But it ran along one of them, and it was a very circuitous route. Anyways, in 1917, that's when it actually started running over the Frisco, and it would run the Frisco route from St. Louis to Vinita, Oklahoma. And this actually made the Texas Special the fastest train between St. Louis and Texas, which kind of also adds to why the Cotton Belt was never really big on competing on passenger trains, since it was always kind of, third fiddle, compared to the other trains that running this route, because, the Missouri Pacific always had a better route compared to them anyways. Anyways, this is just a picture of the Blue Bonnet when it was still running as a steam-powered train, and it ran up into Kansas City. It may have had branches into St. Louis. I couldn't find a clear designation on that. So if anyone wants to leave it down in the comments whether or not it also ran to St. Louis, and was it the quasi-secondary train that just split a lot? Because I also know the Texas Special did split in Texas and go to various cities as well. Anyways, as I was mentioning, though, after the war, the route was fully streamlined into its crimson glory. Each railroad had bought one set of equipment to furnish the train, and the Special was able to make the run to Fort Worth in 14 hours, and it made it to San Antonio in 21 hours. And the Frisco even ordered an extra set of equipment to run a streamlined train from St. Louis to Oklahoma City called the Meteor, which had actually started running a couple days before the new Texas Special started running in 1948. And at St. Louis, the Texas Special offered through car service to New York over the Pennsy and Washington over the B&O railroads. And this is actually what the equipment looked like, which the stainless steel fluting on non-Bud equipment was actually kind of a rarity in these days. And after watching There's Your Problem podcast, I actually learned out why. Is because the stainless steel would trap water behind it, which would just corrode the steel on top of it, which was a very big maintenance issue, which is why equipment like this was not particularly popular. But given that the Southwest and the part of the Midwest is a much drier climate, I'm wondering if that was not really a huge issue for them, or did they just not think about that at the time? So they just kind of rolled with it. But from what I understand, you more or less bought this equipment if you wanted the stainless steel fluting of Bud equipment, but you didn't want to pay for it. So you bought cheaper equipment and just had some stainless steel slapped on the side. Anyways, there's the decline, which is where we always go on this. And as time went on, it did well through the 50s, but it declined in the latter half of the 50s due to the Katy's poor maintenance of itself. So the Texas Special suffered. By 1959, the on-time performance and condition of the train on the Katy side of the road had declined so much that the Frisco canceled it on their side of the network, and the remainder only lasted about 6 years to when the Katy canceled what was left of it, so it didn't make it to see Amtrak at all. And also, yes, the picture up here does have the little disclaimer, but subtitle of that being the Florida Special in Alabama. Eventually, that train's going to get talked about too, but couldn't find a picture of the Texas Eagle. That's going to be in one of the next videos. The Texas Special towards its end, so I just kind of yanked this picture from, I think, Wikipedia. But anyways, that's, trains were in very sorry state in the late 60s. Anyways, this is where we're going to get into, the food options, which is usually somewhere, I usually stick this somewhere in the middle, but, no, that just didn't happen. So as you can see here, there's the dinner on the side and on the left, and then the a la carte on the right. And from what I can see, they had more or less the same kind of array, and this would have been, I think, from the mid-50s, so basically the height of its existence. At least on the Frisco, this is a Frisco menu. I don't know what the menu would. I don't know what train this is from, by the way. It could be from the Florida Special for all I know. But there were 5 dinner options, and then there's just a usual array of a la carte options on the side, like salads and sandwiches and dessert and beverages and all that fun stuff. And the plates included haddock, half-fried chicken, Salisbury steak, calf's liver, and a charcoal broiled steak, which came with salad, potatoes, and dinner rolls, and a beverage. And if I can tell, the calf's liver did come with a slice of apple pie, and I am willing to bet that because even the bacon on the calf's liver couldn't save it. So I don't know. I don't get people who like liver. I'm just saying it's weird to me. I don't eat it, and just saying. Anyways, this is going to be the end of this video, and it might be a little bit shorter than actually. It's not actually coming out to being a normal length video, but thank you for being here, and I do enjoy your guys' comments, your liking, sharing, subscribing, doing all the YouTube things, and I just hope to see you in the next video, and thank you for all the subbing and the commenting that has already been done, and I'll see you in the next one.